Hi, it's Steve Hart, and welcome to the closing keynote of this really terrific mini conference, Small, Rural, and Independent Libraries. Crosby Kemper is here. Thanks so much to San Jose State's School of Information, founding partner for the Library 2.0 conferences and mini conferences. I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Sandy Hirsch for just one moment.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you all for participating, and I'm really excited about our next speaker who will be joining us in just a second to spend the next hour with us. And again, I want to thank Kate and Jim for the work that they did in helping us prepare. And I'm really thrilled to get to know the small and rural and independent library community and to see what kind of vibrancy and excitement there is, and learn more about the challenges and opportunities that exist and all the work that you're doing and really making a difference in your communities all around the world. So I don't want to take any more of Crosby's time, so I'm going to turn it over to him. But again, welcome to our closing keynote.
Great. Sandy, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Kate Laughlin and Steve Hargadon too for helping get me here. And I'm speaking to you on my iPhone because my computer's not working well. So I apologize if the video is not good, and it's not just because I'm trying to hide behind the iPhone video. So I'm the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and I'm the brand new director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I got this job, the confirmation came in January, towards the end of January. It's a presidential appointment. And about 10 days after I was confirmed, the president sent his budget up to Capitol Hill, which defunded me and the IMLS. And then, a couple weeks after that, the pandemic hit, and I was told to leave my office. So I was defunded and told to leave my office. I did not take any of this personally. I just want you to know. I didn't take it personally, though. It was not exactly what I envisioned, and it's certainly not, I'm sure, in all of your lives, what you envisioned. And in addition, of course, to the pandemic, we have the protests, the great upheaval, and some really remarkable changes in our lives. And I want to talk a little bit about these changes, what it means for the library world, what it means for our world generally, and what it means particularly in terms of a word that has always been important in the library world, but in the last 20 or 30 years has become even more important, the word community. Some of you will have read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, or maybe his sequel, to that, Better Together. Bowling Alone, of course, is about the decline of community in America. And Putnam was, I think, right about most of what he said in that book, but he got some criticism from folks who said, but there are some forms of community that are growing. And he heard, of course, from librarians and library patrons about this. He heard from a lot of other, he wrote some interesting chapters in his sequel, Better Together, about a number of different ways of the new formation of community. And he talked about mega churches, for instance. But I think the best chapter in the book was about branch libraries. And he talked specifically about a branch library in Chicago that sat on the border of the Gold Coast and a more inner city neighborhood, and that served patrons, some of the wealthier parts of the Chicago community and some of the more challenged parts of the Chicago community, and about how they came together in this branch. And I thought it was a beautiful statement about libraries from the late 90s. And there have been a lot written since then about the importance of libraries. And the members of ARSL, of course, know this. You're the heart and soul of libraries as community. You've always been the center of your communities, and always been attuned to the community part of what libraries do. So some of what I'm going to say today, you know in your hearts and you know from your practice, but I want to reinforce the importance of what's happened in our world, and that makes what we do historically even more important, and getting back to it, which is going to be very difficult, as important as it could possibly be. So, when the protests began, when the pandemic, we were just beginning to start to deal with the pandemic when George Floyd was murdered, in fact, and the nation erupted in the protests that have become a national upheaval, a national stock taking, a national. We're stepping back and looking at ourselves and who we are as a nation. There's been violence, of course. There've been broken windows and tear gas and flashbangs and pepper spray. There's also something different from previous episodes like this that I think are really important to note. I'm old enough, older than almost everybody in this audience, I'm going to assume, and I can remember 1968, the riots after Martin Luther King died, after Martin Luther King was assassinated. I remember, in fact, 1965, the Watts riots. I remember 1964 riots in New York, and this feels much different than those. Feels different than the Rodney King episode in 1992. And what's different about it is the size of the peaceful protests. Some of the peaceful protests have ended up being corrupted by people who want to break windows and loot and things like that. There has been a lot of challenge between police and protesters. But something, we also see some things that we didn't see in those other events. Besides the immense amount of peaceful protests around the country, we're up to 160 or 170 or 180 separate locations for peaceful, separate cities for peaceful protests. It may be more than that at this stage. But what we see in these protests has been unique. We see hugging, and we see shaking of hands or bumping of elbows. We see Black Lives Matter, which was considered by some to be a radical organization, being embraced by the establishment in this country. We see their symbols, we see BLM, we see the t-shirts, we see something, and we see them on people of all colors and all ages. So there's something different going on, and it's universalizing. It's gone international. People are protesting around the world, and they're protesting their own versions, and they're protesting with us and for us. This is breaking all kinds of boundaries in our country. It's an extraordinary moment. It's a moment I think we'll be not only telling our children, our grandchildren about, but had a conversation this afternoon with Betsy Peterson, who's the head of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and they're collecting, they're already working on collecting materials from the protests and from the pandemic, because they recognize that this is going to be marked as an important moment in American history. And the real question about this is, will it be a turning point? Will it just be another event that we'll write about because it's happened before and will happen again? Or is it going to be an event that we'll write about because it changed something in this country? And if it changed something in this country, will it have changed it with the help and aid of libraries and librarians, or will we sit it out? The pandemic, of course, has forced everyone to sit things out, and we were just beginning as the protests began to get used to the idea that we might actually reopen libraries. I want to talk for a minute about one of the most important events in recent history. That it's important because the resonance it has today, and it's created in the protests, and that I think is a symbol of why things have changed. And I'm going to tell a little story about myself and change in doing this. In addition to the handshakes and the hugs and that, one of the gestures that's happening around the country is kneeling. The Colin Kaepernick tribute or stance, a stance that is taking a knee, but is also making a stand in its way. And I'll tell us a little story about myself. About a year and a half ago, something like that, maybe it was 2 years ago, the Urban League in Kansas City, second oldest urban league in the United States, had its annual lunch. And the program for the annual lunch was a panel about Colin Kaepernick. And I was invited by Gwen Grant, my good friend, who is the head of the Urban League in Kansas City. She wanted somebody to take the other side. She had a lot of panelists who were willing to defend and celebrate Colin Kaepernick, so she wanted somebody on the other side, and I was her sacrificial lamb for that, knowing my conservative political views. And so I showed up, and I did say I thought that it was unfortunate because I thought it was divisive and not helpful to Colin Kaepernick's own point about police brutality, that he was losing some of his audience by doing this in football game, during the national anthem, before the game, etc. And I may or may not have been right at that point about that, but I said one other thing at the time, which I'm, in retrospect, I think was prescient about what's happened today. And that is, I said, whatever you think about, whether you think it's right or wrong to be protesting at that point in that way, it was an incredibly respectful way that he was doing it, because he was kneeling, which is an act it's a prayerful act. It's in some sense, a Christian sense, in other religions, a submissive act. It's essentially a respectful act. And I said, that as a protest, that's about as good as it gets. It's respectful, it's peaceful, and clearly it's had a huge amount of resonance. It's been adopted by many of the protesters and extraordinarily by some of the police and folks on the other side. So I think that that act and the acts that have happened since then make what we're seeing in the United States a different moment, a different kind of moment, and we may have seen some of that from the Supreme Court this week as well. Symbolically, the nation has adopted Colin Kaepernick's protest. Even some sense that he might be hired again in the NFL, but I wouldn't hold my breath about that. And so, we have a rainbow coalition that now includes protesters and police, black and white and brown and yellow and red, and we're all kneeling. And I think that's makes this a great moment. So at moments like this, I like to turn to the great analyst of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, who writes in Democracy in America about a lot about Protest and Democracy. He writes a lot about the public spirit in democracy. And indeed, he has a chapter on the public spirit in the United States, in which he says, epics sometimes occur, like that. Epics sometimes occur in the course of existence of a nation at which ancient customs of a people are changed. Traditions which the diffusion of knowledge has found broken, the imperfect expression of civil rights of a community are ill secured. And the most powerful means of interesting men in the welfare of their country is to make them partake in the government, to make them exercise their political rights. And it seems to me that that's what's going on here, that there is an entirely new form of exercising our political rights. That's a quote from Democracy in America. And so where does that leave the library community? We were building a sense of community in libraries. We were building libraries in this country as the place of a community. There were two trends in the library world, I think, before the pandemic broke out and before the upheaval. And the first is very obvious to everyone, and it will remain obvious. And that is we were going electronic, virtual, and online. Ebooks, streaming services, virtual librarians, computers, job searching and healthcare online, community and government information. The librarian is the navigator of the virtual universe. The library card is the power tool, opening up the community. The library is the place you cross the digital divide. And it's interesting, as we went into the funding cycle, both for the libraries, the IMLS budget, the NEH and the NEA and other agencies as we go into the next fiscal year. And then as we went into a completely separate budget cycle for the CARES Act, one of the fascinating things to me was, and I was involved in stimulating some of this, which I'll get to in 1 second, but one of the fascinating things to me was all of a sudden there was a bipartisan interest in the digital divide. It had always existed to some extent sub rosa in Congress, in Capitol Hill generally, and in the agencies, and indeed even in the White House. Just some of you may know, I chaired Shelby School's Healthcare Libraries and Broadband Coalition based in DC. That's an advocacy organization while I was the director of the Kansas City Public Library, and lobbied on Capitol Hill, lobbied at the FCC, and in the other agencies for broadband. And we've always got a friendly response on the Hill and in the agencies, but not a huge amount of movement, a typical Beltway problem. And all of a sudden, in February and March, really in March, that changed. And all of a sudden we were seeing members of Congress talk about the digital divide and indeed start to put down markers on bills talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars for hotspots and to be delivered to small and rural libraries. We're finding a coalition of people on the left who had traditionally cared about their voters in the inner city, allied with folks on the right who cared about their perceived voters in rural areas and smaller communities across the country. And this is heartening. This is very heartening. And part of our CARES Act money at the IMLS was indeed specifically directed, and again, I've been lobbying for this, so I will take a tiny bit of credit for this, was specifically targeted at the digital divide. And in addition to that, in a way that had not ever been contemplated before, we got targeting for the virus, for the effects of the virus, and an understanding that we were going to use our money to be designed to have the biggest impact on the areas that were most affected, which, as I think everybody on this call will know, because you're readers, you know, that the poor, minorities, the aged, those in nursing homes, those in prison, the most challenged people in our communities are in fact the most affected. And the residual effects of the virus are also going to be enormous for our poor, minority, and older communities for a variety of reasons. The economic reasons alone, the elimination of jobs in the retail sector and elsewhere is going to be hardest on them. So we know that though we've had these wonderful trends in the library world towards the electronic, a lot of what's happened now in going virtual is of course eliminated jobs, and will continue to eliminate jobs, and so though we will return to a universe in which libraries are providing virtual services, we have to remember that that's not all to the good. And in our communities, what the library services themselves are good, but we have to focus in using those services to remember to help the folks who are looking for jobs in the real world, looking for healthcare information in the real world, looking for education in the real world. And we have to ally ourselves increasingly with the physical world in doing things that we have been doing virtually, and vice versa. The other trend of the last 20 years that I've already mentioned, with the mention of Robert Putnam, and I noticed in the chat, Eric Kleinenberg was mentioned as Palaces of the People, and we could talk about books like the Fallows, Jim and Deborah Fallows, and their jaunt across the country. It was in the Atlantic, Step by Step, in which they visited many small towns across the country and always found the library as the anchor of the community. We've seen a wave, in fact, of conversation in the public dimension of talk about libraries as anchors, as community centers. That has been a huge trend in the library world, and we've always been a center of the community, but we became a gathering place for the community. Groups and classes gathered, films and lectures, crafts, family fun nights. Library recreated itself as a place in the imagination. We were already the most trusted institution in America. We were always about enlightenment, sometimes about entertainment, always about the people's university, self-development. And now we became the community center as well. We were always a democratic institution, with a small d, I should say. Now we were perhaps the democratic institution. We were the place where this thing that we keep talking about, academics talk about it endlessly, your civic leaders are always talking about it. We saw a decline in it, but perhaps it was reviving in libraries, and that is civic engagement. It's something, as the director of the library in Kansas City, I was always focused on. We did issue programming, we did lifelong learning programming. We brought the leadership of the community together. We worked with every community organization we could. And in particular, we worked with organizations in the community that needed civic visibility and didn't always have them, whether they were literacy organizations, economic development organizations on the east side, the poorest and minority part of Kansas City, the Urban League's State of Black Kansas City was always unrolled every other year in the library, and we focused on that. And I know many of you have focused in the same way. And of course, in smaller communities, libraries are almost automatically the location of civic events. So where do we go now with that? The electronic thing will accelerate in its own way. You know, with ebooks, I was talking to Tony Marks of the New York Public Library about a week ago, and Tony was talking about how their ebook circulation had gone up 30 or 40%. Maybe it was a little more than that, it was something in that range, and that's extraordinary during the pandemic, and it's great. It's a service, a huge service to the community. But then we talked about who was actually using those services, and it's essentially the same people who are using them before, and that means it's not actually crossing the digital divide, because most of our customers before who are using ebooks and our various electronic services are essentially middle and upper middle class folks. The IMLS intends to do a convening around this subject in the relatively near future. I'd like to do it in person, but we'll probably have to do it virtually, which may be appropriate. Because I think we've heard a siren song about ebooks, which has a great melody, but lacks some resonance. Lacks resonance to folks who need education in this country and aren't getting it. It has little resonance for those people who need to do homework online and don't have an online access or the device on which they can do it. And so that's going to become increasingly important as a challenge for us. We know that telemedicine is expanding and will, but access to telemedicine for some people is still going to be a challenge. At least we now have, I think, Congress and leaders, civic and business leaders and political leaders nationally understanding the importance of telemedicine. I'm not sure if they understand the library's role in that, but we will work to make sure that they do. In the social distancing universe, of course, our computers will continue to be available, but placing them 6 feet apart and having to clean them after every use and doing the other things that we're going to have to do is a challenge. I do want to stop for a second and tell you about something that the IMLS is doing on this side towards reopening libraries that I think is very important. I'm going to get to the real importance of reopening, which isn't the electronic universe and isn't necessarily all the traditional things that we've done in libraries, but has to do with the community focus of libraries in a second. But I do want to tell you something the IMLS is doing about reopening in order to make it happen so that we can get back to being a community, a library world focused on the community. So we did a seminar with the CDC about 6 weeks ago now, 7 weeks ago. And the CDC gave a fine presentation, but there were about 3,000 people on the webinar, and there were a lot of questions from librarians in particular, a few from museums, about reopening, and specifically about the virus on things like books, library materials. And the CDC, the reaction initially was, that's an interesting question. they had not thought through public spaces, intensely used public spaces like libraries and museums. The Smithsonian did a webinar about 4 days after that. It was primarily museums. And the same thing happened. They hadn't thought about what would go, the folks from Johns Hopkins were doing that one. And they hadn't really thought about the difficulties of reopening for public spaces, public institutions with public spaces. And so we determined at that point, I got some help in figuring this out from Jim Neal, the former Columbia Library head, and from Pat Lisinski, the library director in Columbus, Ohio. They put us together, and the IMLS created with the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian as partners and the National Archives. We created what we were calling REALM, Reopening Archives, Libraries, and Museums, in which we got Battelle, the science research organization in Columbus, Ohio. Pat knew them. John Sabo, the LA librarian, is chairman of the board, a good friend. And they already had the virus in their laboratories. And so we asked them to begin putting the virus on library materials and eventually on museum materials. And then we went to the OCLC and we asked them to create a website where, among other things, they and Battelle and a scientific advisory committee that we created with people from Yale and NYU and UCLA and elsewhere, as well as people from the Smithsonian and NARA and the Library of Congress, to oversee, from a scientific point of view, not only the serious research we're doing at Battelle, but also the literature of all the research that's being done around the world, what's been published and what we know from that research, so that we could create on this website, which is now live on OCLC's Web Junction website, now live, so we could create science and fact-based information on which you can make your decisions about reopening. Because what we found after our CDC webinar and the Johns Hopkins Smithsonian webinar and the release of a Johns Hopkins report about public places reopening that didn't quite understand the library world, is that there was a lot of fear in the library world. And fear in the library world is kind of a unique phenomenon. I mean, we have our problems, and there have been particularly some safety problems in libraries in the last 2 or 3 years. And those of you who've been involved in urban libraries, large urban libraries, know that sometimes it's a tough universe. But really, librarians, in all the natural disasters we've had, in facing up to the issues we have in our cities with the homeless, with crime, with whatever it might be, librarians have always shown themselves to be fearless advocates of doing the right thing, of being community advocates. So seeing this fear around the pandemic was something that we wanted to address as directly as we could. And I think we've done that. We've had a lot of help. The Library of Congress, we use some of our CARES Act money. The Library of Congress has contributed money. The Mellon Foundation has come through. Carnegie, run by one of the great librarians in history, Vartan Gregorian, who ran the New York Public Library at an important moment in its life, that have all come together to do this. And I hope that you all, those of you who haven't been on the website, will go take a look at it. And I hope you'll also contribute to it. You can tell us what your experience is, and what your questions are, what your needs are as we're reopening. There is a timeline that I think should be up now about Battelle's research, because that is one of the big questions, obviously. They've already done some successful, i.e. complete experiments with the virus on books, and we're beginning to roll that out. But there's a timeline about how we're releasing the information from Battelle on the website now, I believe. So we've done that, and slowly, painfully, we're all looking at reopening. The problems with books will ultimately be solved. We'll understand the science of that. The problems of social distancing will ultimately we'll figure out the epidemiology of this. Every day there are interesting pieces of information, sometimes of course contradicting what you read yesterday, but there's slowly but surely we're figuring this out. Our computers will find their users. Our spaces will slowly accommodate themselves to the new normal, whatever that new normal is. The curbside pickups and the modest openings that we already have will increase. There's a thing that used to be talked about by John Maynard Keynes about the economy that I think we can talk about with the economy. We can talk about with all the social things that human beings do. We are social beings. We are political beings. We have animal spirits, as Keynes used to talk about with the economy, and you can see that, of course, on beaches right now and in restaurants around the country. But I think you're going to see it in libraries before too long. We're going to want to open. Our communities are going to want us to be open, and so that brings up the question of our space and our place in the community. That third place that we've become, or for many people, the first or second place. We are sometimes literally people's homes, home for many people, and sometimes we're a preferred place for folks who want to get out of whatever their environment is, at work or at home or as you know, on the street. So what happens to these palaces of the people when we get out of quarantine, if we ever get out of quarantine, which we will? What happens to the People's University if the classroom can't be full? What happens to an anchor institution in this universe? We've been a refuge and a playground and a living room and a home for a lot of people, and so we can't be just virtual. We can't just be about ebooks and librarians on the telephone or in the chat room. We expanded our virtual education dramatically, but one of the things we know in Kansas City, we were doing the Career Online High School, and out of the MIT Media Lab, we were doing the P2P university, peer-to-peer university, the curated online courses, et cetera. One of the things we learned in all of that is you still have to have a human being. It's nice to have the library space as part of it. We know that to do these virtual things, you still need a human base. You still need what librarians have always done best, which is face-to-face interaction with their communities. That's not going away. So in this quest for community, I want to go back to Tocqueville again for a minute. One of the most famous chapters in Democracy in America is called, it's chapter 5 of volume 2. For those of you who I know I'm watching the chat room, I know that this will come up. It's chapter 5 of volume 2, of the use which Americans make of public associations in civil life. And Tocqueville says, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations, commercial, religious, moral, serious, futile, extensive or restrictive, enormous or diminishing. They found schools, buildings, give entertainments, construct churches, diffuse books, send missionaries, found hospitals, prisons, advance some truth or foster some feeling by the encouragements of a great example. They form a society. This is what the associations, Americans' associational energy does. This is a kind of face-to-face work that is the work that has been happening in libraries for the last 30 years. As we've lost various forms of community, we've reformed community. We've reformed all these things that Tocqueville talk about inside the library. Feelings and, he says again, feelings and opinions are recruited in the heart, and the heart is enlarged, and the human mind is developed by no other means than by the reciprocal influence of men on each other. So I wanted, in a democratic country, these feelings, the feelings of the heart are created in the associational things that we do. And now I'm going to give you my favorite example of what happened in the Kansas City Public Library that reflects this. A handful of you may have heard this story before, so I apologize if you have. There was a black man in Kansas City with an 8th grade education. Grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. His name is Alvin Sykes. He was self-educated at the library after his 8th grade graduation. His mother had always taken him to the library. He knew about it, both Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. He was a musician. A friend of his was killed in what turned out to be a bias killing at Liberty Memorial in Kansas City. Yeah, and an all-white jury acquitted his killer. And Alvin thought that this was a huge injustice, as it was. And he had heard about civil rights statutes being used in these circumstances. In fact, it had only been used once before. But he went to the Kansas City Public Library. He asked the librarian about it, and they got out the US Civil Code, and he found the right statute. And he called the local prosecutor. He said, well, this is a federal thing. So he called the federal prosecutor in Kansas City. It was turned away by both. And he called the Attorney General's office, the United States Attorney General's office. He got a junior, this will tell you how long ago this was, he got a junior assistant attorney general by the name of Antonin Scalia on the line. And Scalia said, you know, I think you're right. And you should go back to the federal prosecutor and say that you heard from the Attorney General's office, this probably ought to be looked into. And he did that. And the prosecutor got a conviction under the civil rights laws of this man, who is, by the way, still in jail. And Alvin started out on a career of cold case civil rights activism. And ultimately, along with Emmett Till's family, they created something called the Till Bill, and ultimately created the cold case section of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Except they had one little barrier they had to get over. There was the most conservative, fiscally most conservative man in the United States Senate, Republican senator from Oklahoma, named Tom Coburn. And at that point, there was you were able to, if you were a senator, you were able to block something if there was no fund. You couldn't show in the budget where the funding could come from. And this was brand new, so they couldn't show where the funding came from. So he was blocking it. So Alvin went and sat in his office, and he sat in his office for about 3 weeks. And finally, Tom Coburn saw him. And Coburn listened to Alvin and changed his mind and allowed the bill to go through. And I thought this was an interesting story. So I talked to Alvin about it. Alvin remained friends with Tom Coburn. Tom retired. He had got cancer, and he retired from the Senate. He also believed in term limits. And so I said, Alvin, do you think Tom Coburn would come to the library and have a conversation about this? And so Alvin and I invited Senator Coburn, and he came. And as it turned out, they weren't just friends. We had a conversation that brought tears to the eyes of the 350 people who were in the audience, a very mixed audience, black and white, and young and old. And Tom Coburn said about Alvin Sykes, the civil rights activist. Alvin's a Buddhist and a musician, and pretty forceful about his opinions. And Tom Coburn, probably the most conservative member of the Senate, said that he had, not metaphorically, but truly, in a very human sense, fallen in love with Alvin Sykes. That Alvin's truth was so strong, that Alvin's complete lack of selfish motives was so strong, so powerful, that he came to love Alvin, not merely to accept his arguments, but to love him. And that was an extraordinary moment for me, probably the most extraordinary moment in my life in the library, to see this retired United States Senator and this man with an 8th grade education who'd made a huge difference in our country. And I tell you this story because I think this story resonates with our time. It resonates with our libraries in our time. I don't know how soon we will all come out of the pandemic. I don't know what the ultimate results will be for police departments and municipalities, and ultimately for justice in America, of the protests of Black Lives Matter, of the great desire in this country that crosses a lot of our traditional boundaries for real reform. But I do know that libraries need to play a role in it. And I know that the place where the kind of reciprocity that Tocqueville talks about, which is a reciprocity of the heart, ultimately, takes place in libraries because of our ability to bring people together, because people trust us. People on the right and on the left trust us. People trust our ability to understand the community. People trust our ability to understand that notion in Tocqueville, and that notion that Alvin understood in Tom Coburn, and Tom Coburn understood in Alvin Sykes, that reciprocity of love for justice, and ultimately love for each other as human beings. I think that, to me, is the greatest lesson that I learned as a librarian, and that I want, as the director of the IMLS, to find ways of taking into the library world and the museum world, which is very similar in this regard, to Capitol Hill and to the White House, to the public prints and to the media, is libraries are places where this can happen, where democracy happens, where community happens, where equality is not just a word, is a feeling, is an activity, it's a profession. And so I will finish with this thought, and I'm happy to take your questions about any of this, or about the future or my past, or whatever you'd like. But I believe that you can't have a democracy, and I think I learned this from Tocqueville and from Alvin Sykes and Tom Coburn. You can't have democracy without equality. You can't have equality without respect. And you can't have respect without engagement, but you also can't have engagement without respect. That's a conundrum, or just simply something we know. We have to begin to associate again as Americans. We have to reopen as libraries for the good of our community, because we know what to do with those spaces. Thank you. So,
Hi, this is Steve here. Crosby, thank you. I've captured some questions that came through in the chat, and there are a couple in the Q&A. Can I feed them to you?
sure, absolutely. I can take a look at them too. So
Okay,
some will go by.
So the first one came in from Patty quite early. She said, where do school libraries stand in this discussion of community?
Oh, well, so that is a great question. And of course, as you know, and as the IMLS does absolutely know, and I apologize if anyone feels I've left out school libraries or research libraries, specialized libraries of various kinds who are immensely important in this. So number one, the truth that we all have to face is that school libraries are probably the most challenged libraries economically, and challenged for a variety of reasons, because they're inside school systems, and their schools are going to be immensely economically challenged by what's happened and what's likely to happen with school district budgets and municipal budgets. It's going to be slow in coming, as it is for many public libraries, because there's a sort of rolling aspect to property tax, but it's going to come. And we all know from what's gone on over the last 20 years or so that school libraries are more vulnerable than probably any other kind of library. But at the same time, one of the most important things, and again, I'll use my experience in Kansas City as an example, one of the most important things for us to know and for the world to know, for us to tell the world, is the relationship of public libraries and school libraries with school districts is an incredibly important relationship. We took over the back office for the Kansas City school district libraries some time ago. We also made sure that we got a library card in the hands of every student in the Kansas City School District, and we worked hand in glove with the school librarians to make that happen and to give the school librarians as much access and as much help as we possibly could. And we've turned that program into a larger program. I mentioned the library card as a power tool for the community. We've got a great relationship with the superintendent in Kansas City, and he who called the card a power tool. We're working with Kauffman Foundation and others to try and make the library card an access tool for the kids, particularly in the Kansas City School District, or the most challenged kids in the community, particularly for them, but for everybody, for every child in Kansas City, as an access card to everything that goes on in the community, everything educational, sports and recreation, museums, performing arts organizations, and of course, transportation. Now, various places around the country have done this, or done pieces of this, and it's an outgrowth of a lot of programs over the last few years, Connect Ed, Connect Home, et cetera. And so I think this is a very roundabout way of saying there's an ecosystem here that includes school libraries and public libraries, and possibly even academic libraries and research libraries, because they can become really important to the aspirations. They're unified response to the needs and the aspirations of kids can be an important thing for the future of the community. So I hope I don't leave school libraries out ever.
Colleen asks in the Q&A, can you give any kind of a quick summary of the Battelle report? For example, how many days should we be quarantining books with plastic covers?
So I have promised my staff and the OCLC and Battelle that I would send you to the website rather than popping off. I would say that there's no definitive research yet on any aspect of this. We know that the virus in certain circumstances doesn't last very long. I will say that to you. It's for those of you who need to go to it. I'm sorry, I should have brought it with me, the exact, but it's Web Junction. If you go to the Web Junction, actually, if you just Google Web Junction, you'll get to Web Junction, which is the OCLC's informational website, and on the homepage you can find the link to the reopening to the Realm website. It's called REALM, part of the website. So I will say that we're slowly narrowing down the length of time that the virus stays on stuff, and that one of the things we know from the general research out there, as well as Battelle's research, is that we're more and more narrowly defining what the problems and the issues are, and it will help us reopen, I think, in the very near future.
Okay, this next question is a couple of sentences. This is from Mindy. When considering issues of capacity for small and rural libraries, both in staff and physical space, what practical focus is recommended for library programs and funding pursuits to counter the local digital divide? The vast differences in infrastructure and community access make a single approach impossible to encapsulate. However, there is a commonality of needs. Where can we look for leadership and voice on a comprehensive plan to address these critical new needs in small and rural library environments?
So that's a great question, and to a certain extent, you've already answered your own question, which is there's not one solution. There are a lot of solutions. The first thing I'll say, this has been my mantra from my days in Kansas City, from chairing Shelby, from helping to found the NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And number one, I would urge everybody to go look at the NDIA's website and the Shelby website. They're working on this every day. But my mantra has always been use every community institution you've got as partners, number one. Number two, we have to establish Wi-Fi everywhere we can. There is no one solution to this. We're not going to use the universal service, though the FCC has been a good actor in the pandemic on this. They've responded to the pandemic and encouraged the telcos and the cable companies and others, all the providers of broadband services, to get real and get cheap, and that there's been a big direction there, but that doesn't solve all the problems. Hotspots are a big deal, and can be very helpful in many circumstances, particularly in rural areas and in inner city areas. And one of the things I will tell you that I think is going to happen, I hope will happen, is Congress is really focused on that. They want to throw money at the hotspot. Not all of them, and I probably overstated this a little bit, and I'll be in trouble tomorrow for this. But actually, I think Congress wants to fund the hotspots, and they're trying to figure out the rest of it. The hotspots will go a long way. I think they're expensive. They're relatively expensive. And they're not the final solution, and there is no final solution. It's going to be a group of solutions, but that's going to be a big help. And last but not least, I'll say this. I didn't think this would happen in my lifetime. I wasn't sure I wanted it to happen in my lifetime, but I think that Congress has begun to see, and I think nationally we've begun to see, that the idea of broadband as a utility. It took the pandemic to do this. The need for telemedicine, the need for community and government information, and what's going to happen as we're coming out. I mean, we already need it, but the need for job searching information, for using our online resources to find jobs, to apply for jobs. We all know that in the library world, but finally the rest of the world's getting the idea, is creating I think a genuine view of broadband as a needed utility. And I think you'll see funding around this. I can't guarantee anything. We're also going to see huge budget deficits and a lot of different pressures because of that. But I will tell you that in the last CARES Act, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the IMLS in a much smaller way, got money, that significant amount of money that for the first time was dedicated to crossing the digital divide. And I think there's more of that coming.
Okay, I think we'll make this the final question. This is from Allison. Can you suggest a few recommended reads for library workers to foster further engagement?
Well, certainly, I'd say the granddaddy of our current concern with community would be Robert Putnam and his book "Better Together" in the chapter on libraries. I think The Palaces of the People by Eric Kleinenberg, the Fallows book, Our Towns, which talks about libraries frequently. I think that's where I'd start with those books. There are a lot of really good books about libraries and about reading that are out there, where libraries play a role in the books about reading. I probably ought to put some things up on our website on the IMLS about that, and I will.
Good. Perfect timing. Thank you so much. That was delightful.
Great. Thank you all very much for coming together around this, and I enjoyed being here. Thanks so much to Arcel. I appreciate what you all do.
Truly appreciate that. Thank you, Crosby. Thanks to the iSchool at San Jose State University. This is Steve Hargadon. I'm going to turn the meeting off. The recording should be up sometime late tomorrow. Bye now.
Bye.